Previously on Wednesday night Bible study, kind of a thing, we began our look at the wedding feast in Cana, and we sort of set the stage, right? We have the 5 disciples in Jesus so far who attend a wedding with the mother of Jesus. Mary is not named in the book, just like John isn't named. We talked about that last week. These two, for lack of a better word, characters within the story have their value based on the fact of their relationship with Jesus, right? So that sort of sets up this story about what kind of comes through. Again, one of the primary ideas that John is trying to get into our heads, not my brother, the evangelist, but John is trying to get into our heads, that may be his prerogative as well, is that Christ is in control of the situation. So there are 2 ways we want to look at this instant. In our minds, we want to look at it from the cosmological sense plus the historical sense. For John, the evangelist, these are inescapable. We know that from fighting through his prologue, how important it is for him to set up the real history of these events. He never has the idea that he's not doing the real work of history, but also that behind all of this, there's this massive cosmological significance. There's this massive salvation history significance happening just right behind the scenes. So we left off last week talking about the conversation between Jesus and Mary, where Mary brings to Jesus' attention, right, that there's no wine at this wedding, right? They've run out of wine, right? They had wine, is all gone. This is a great scandal for a wedding, right? In a sense, the wine was the symbolism of the celebration itself, right? So the fact that you had no wine meant that the celebration was over, right? And that it's a symbolic of it being kind of a dead thing, right? So when Jesus then responds to her, again, it's important to recognize that it's not an imperative statement she makes to him. She doesn't say, "Hey, Jesus, get off your duff and make wine." Right? That's not what she says. She's respectful and reverential of him. And then his response to her is not one of sort of dismissal. It's one of acknowledging. She has to acknowledge the great mission he's on. Right? He tells her, "My hour is not yet come." That the purpose of him coming to earth is always the cross. Right? I mean, that's John's term for the cross, right, is the hour. Right? So that's all down the road. So again, what's fascinating, though, is that despite that this obviously is not as important as the hour, Jesus, what we'll see today, finds a way out of love and grace for his creation to integrate it into that plan. Right? I mean, if something to think about, if Jesus doesn't change the water into wine, right? This is just Jesus goes to an embarrassing wedding. It wouldn't be in the gospel. It would just we wouldn't know about it, right? It'd just be a thing that happened to Jesus that we don't. One more piece of data. But because Jesus chooses to do this at this time, it integrates it into the whole story of Jesus' salvation of the world. There's a lot going on here. But let's take a look at verse 6. Verse 5 tells us that Mary tells the diakonos, the servants, to go ahead and do whatever Jesus says, which is good advice for everyone all the time, right? If I'm not a big tattoo person, but if one were to get one that said, "Do whatever he says," would be a pretty good one to have. Maybe on one's eyelids, so when you close your eyes, you saw that. It's a good strategy. But let's look at verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Now, there are lots of ways one could write water jars in Greek. Specifically here, though, John makes an emphasis of the fact that you have these stone jars that are there. Notice it's front-loaded on the sentence of this, the lithithne jars, right? So what is this about? Well, what's interesting, what we talked about last is sort of this question I left you on, what are these jars for? What are these things here put here? One of the things we even see, even in the service tonight, for instance, is there's the ceremonial washing of the hands, right? The ablutions is still part of our service. And in the temple, that was something that was always done as well. There are various washings one went through in order to enter the temple, and as a priest, there are washings one did. One of the things the Pharisees add on to the law for the people is the ceremonial washings, right? So this was not a normal thing within the Mosaic law that everyone needed to be ceremonially clean. But the idea was the Pharisees were kind of going above and beyond what was normally required of the people. Right? The idea was you sort of make the people kind of do the same thing the priests do. So bring that level of ritual purity onto the people. Again, this isn't the world's worst plan. Right? We're often hard on the Pharisees, but there are, and Jesus is very hard on the Pharisees, right? But there's a sense in which you're always disagree most thoroughly with the people who are closest to you, right? The Pharisees really care. They're just misguided. So the idea that we can make the people so holy that God will then bless us and expel the Romans and bring back the Davidic kingdom is a not a terrible idea, right? It just is wrong. You can have good intentions and be wrong. Most of the time, that's how the world works. People who have good intentions who are just wrong about things, right? And that's the case here. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much you wash the outside of your body, you can't fix the problem of sin that way, right? That's a fundamental truth of the New Covenant, right? See the Old Testament. If all you needed was to have the law put in your face, and then, ritualistic cleanings, you'd be solid, right? Again, that's a huge difference, for instance, between sort of a mikvah washing in the Old Covenant and a baptism, right? And the baptism isn't just the water. The water is an integral part of it. The water is the sign of the thing that's happening. But without the Holy Spirit acting upon that, right? We're just taking a bath, right? It's not too good. So anyway, these six, why stone? Why talk about them being stone? Well, if they're stone jars, it means that their specific purpose was for ritual cleanness. So, for instance, a clay jar that had not been put to a kiln could become unclean, but a stone jar could. So John wants to make sure we get the point here that these 6 stone jars were here for this purpose and were designed to be only used for this sort of ritualist ceremonial cleaning. And the way this works is kind of fascinating. So you'd be sitting at table, and the servants would come by with these huge pots of water, and they'd wash everybody's hands at the table before the meal started. It's kind of very ritualistic, you still see, it's funny, there's still aspects of some of this, and if you've ever been sort of seen like an old Victorian show on PBS where someone comes by and like washes people's hands while they're in between courses of meals, you kind of get some sense of this, but this isn't about cleanliness per se, this is about holiness. Right? That's the big difference here, right? There's tertiary benefits of cleanliness. Like sometimes people will talk about like the Jewish cleanliness laws. Well, it was all about like everyone being clean and hygienic, and that was certainly a tertiary benefit. But at a time when no one knew about germs, that wasn't the first thing on people's minds. And remember, germ theory is not. It's pretty new in terms of what we know, right? Those horrifying. Anyone who's ever watched like Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, and their horrifying notions of uncleanliness that came into people's lives, right? That's not the idea that's happening here, right? But it was a tertiary benefit. So what John is establishing is that these are for this purpose, and they're perpetually clean because they're stone, what they're made out of. So what does Jesus do to these? By calling these out, what he's doing is he's changing these vessels from being for ritual cleanness for celebration. If wine is a symbol of celebration, if wine is a symbol of new life, what you have here is Jesus is taking these old symbols of ritual purity, ritual cleanliness, and converting them to the new use by converting them into vessels of wine. And again, what should that immediately bring into our mind? That should immediately bring into our mind that this is an analogy to the entire mission of Jesus. Think of all the strange times when, for instance, Jesus seems to be breaking the law, right? But as the lawgiver and as the bridegroom who's come, it's time for celebration. It's not time for that observance. So, for instance, we have things like when his disciples are eating the Sabbath, or picking out the fields on the Sabbath, and Jesus says, "Man, the Sabbath is made for man, man's not made for the Sabbath." Remember David when he ate the showbread, calling himself a Davidic king. There's signs of it. Or even tonight's gospel, we read about him healing on the Sabbath. Right? He's positioning himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. There's also a fascinating aspect in here in which the creation is starting again. So if the Sabbath day celebrates the end of the first creation, right? And John is at pains, right? He goes through these days. We're on the third day right now. Why does it matter what day we're on? Third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, all the way up into the resurrection. If he starts his gospel with "in the beginning," right? To tell us that this is the new creation narrative, right? It's starting with Jesus Christ. So if that's the case, we're in this new era where that old Sabbath observance within Christ has changed and modified. With him as the new mediator of the covenant. That's definitely something we should notice here, with this changeover from these stone jars for purification, then being for wine. Remember, once these have wine in them, what can't they be ever used for again? They can't ever be used for ritual cleaning ever again. That's a big deal. That's something that your average that someone familiar with this Jewish law would have known immediately, right? That's not something that hits us right. Well, just wash them out. Come on. I mean, like I've had some weird stuff in Tupperware that I then washed out, and then I could put whatever I want in there, right? Like, oh, I don't know. You ever make that choice? Like, I don't know. I got to throw this out. Like, we're fine, but this is a big deal, right? This has ruined these objects for that purpose. So in a really cool way, this wedding crisis, right, is refracting or changing it. Jesus is moving it from being just about not having wine to it being about an analogy for his entire ministry. It's why he can do this, right? It's not like when he tells Mary, "My hour is not yet come," that he then goes, "Okay, Mary, you win. I'll do whatever you want." Like she doesn't wear him down. Because that's not even in the narrative, right? She didn't nag him. She just leaves and then tells the deacons to do whatever, the servants to do whatever he wants. He finds a way to integrate this into his glory. That's a really neat thing to imagine that he can do that. That he can integrate the needs of the people he loves into his glory. Right? Let's keep going. Let's keep looking at this. Verse 7. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. This "heos ano," to the brim, is the best translation, like all the way to the top. Kind of the idea you have there. So, what's fascinating about this, right, is does it say that Jesus changes the water? It doesn't. The point of the thing, the point of the transfer, though it's fascinating how John tells the story, and also how Jesus does this, obviously, right? Oftentimes we have Jesus, when he does a miracle, he'll use signs. Like, think, for instance, when he heals the blind man by getting mud, spitting the mud and rubbing it into his eyes, right? The imagery of mud, of course, it's dust, right? It's the imagery. He's recreating his eyes, right? That's wild, right? Like you see, just like man navigating dirt, he's recreating his eyes. But here Jesus doesn't do any of that. He just tells the servants, "Pour the water into the jugs," and then it's wine. And John focuses not on because he could have stood up and said, "Water become wine," lightning bolts and things, and holy smokes, people freaking out, right? I mean, that could have happened, but that's not how Jesus chooses to do this here. And we'll see why, but because the moment of transfer is not the focus of this passage at all. There's a fascinating thing. I don't think any of us would write that this way, right? If we were making this up. No, we wouldn't just have Jesus like, "Hey, servants, go ahead and fill up that wine." So, Jesus doesn't take credit for this miracle. That's crazy, right? none of us would not take credit for saving the day, right? Who does that? That's wild. And it also tells us something about his mission too. But yeah. So what's the greater transformation being revealed here? What we have is that in the presence of Jesus, a collection of pure stone water jars for the ceremony washing of people serve as the herald of the fulfillment of the ceremonial law. Right? Why does John have this up to the brim stuff? Right? It's a fascinating detail. What he's telling us is that the stone jars, the 6 stone jars, right? They represent the ceremonial law. And it's up to the top. And then what does Jesus do? He changes it into these massive holdings of celebration. Which is in effect what his ministry is, right? What does Jesus come to herald? The good news, right? Now that starts off with repent, for the kingdom of heaven is hand, right? Repentance is always the first step. Metanoia is always the first step into that kingdom, right? But it is a time of celebration. I mean, it starts to make sense why Jesus, for instance, is dining with reformed publicans and reformed sinners, right? Again, against the Pharisaical law, right? Because if you're trying to keep everybody at arm's length, if you're trying to cut yourself off from those people, they've got to stay away. But if you're enacting, living out this celebration of a new heaven, new earth, if you're the living new world come to life, then you're sort of, every place he goes, he's enacting this kind of feast, this new life feast.
You don't need that water anymore.
No.
You don't need to do that anymore.
I mean, Jesus will specifically say in Mark 7, right, that it isn't what is on the outside of you or what you put into your body that makes the evil of the world. It's what comes out. Right? And then he makes that horrifying list of basically every single sin you can think of, and he says that's not that's not because of what's coming. That's because you're evil. Like he literally says that's because you are evil, and you need. And if you're, I mean that's actually gracious and loving, right? Because we need to know that. Because we need to know that washing in the ceremonial law won't do anything. That time is past. Right? That something greater has come. And the sign of that is the miracle. Right? The miracle is meant to shock us into recognizing that this thing. It's one thing for God to stand up and say, hey, the ceremonial washing is no longer necessary. It's another thing for water to start turning into wine. Right? That's a whole different ballgame. A matter of, and again, what did we say about these vessels? We said these vessels are now no longer, you can't use them for the ceremonial law anymore. They're done with that. It's a really, that's a fascinating thing that's happening. Again, that's the cosmological and historical aspect of this, right? That's always the double-edged sword of John's narrative. We can't ever just sort of focus on one or the other, or just sort of focus on the mundane here. Like, okay, Jesus is great at parties. Like, that's not what you want, right? I was joking last week about a great Saturday Night Live skit where Phil Hartman is Judas. This is old Saturday Night, well, not 90s Saturday Night Live, classic Saturday Night Live, starting to be old. And all the disciples are together, and they come in. Peter looks at all the bottles on the table and goes, Judas, this is all water. Aren't you supposed to buy wine? And Judas says, Jesus, can't he just Judas. I mean, that's one detail John will give us later, is that Judas is cheap. Like, that's a fact, and he's still mad about it too. Like, he's a thief. Like, he didn't say this because he complains when the woman comes and puts the ointment on it, right? And Judas says, "Man, we could have used that for lots of poor people." And John says, he stops the narrative and says, "Remember, this isn't because Judas cared about poor people. It's because he was a thief, right? He held the bag and was a thief. So the first treasurer of the Church of Christ was a thief and a traitor. This should be a warning to people who take on that role." Anyway, that's a fascinating detail. Right, so we're on verse 8. And he said to them, Now, who's them? Who's them? Who's them? Who's them? He said to them. The servants, right? He says to the servants. Again, the lowest people at this thing, right? There's no one lower than the guy who brings you your drink or washes your hands for you at this thing, right? Were they slaves? Maybe. But in any event, not great, right? They're not the ones feasting at this thing, right? He says to the servants, what does he say? Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. This is a great term, this word for master. It's actually right above it in the Greek. It's remember we talked about arche, like archbishop, archangel, is the sort of sign of power and executive authority. So it's a articulino, right? This idea of this sort of powerful person at the feast. It's the master of the feast. Now, sometimes you'll see this, the master of the feast, people say he's kind of like the chief butler or head slave or head servant. But probably, we kind of, the more we know that Jewish weddings, probably he was sort of the more things of the master of ceremonies. Yeah. Right? Kind of one of the guests who sort of had that role of being kind of overseer in charge of everything. But I love that he tells them that, Jesus tells the servants, take this to the master of the feast and have it tried. Which is strange. And actually there's the Greek word here, basically your fourth word over, andlesate. It's a strange word choice actually, because it normally refers to drawing water out of a well. And it's weird to talk about it here, but it's actually a good way of showing that it's been changed from something for washing your hands to something for drinking. Because that's not entirely clear in the narrative, right? Because we kind of know it's coming, so we're kind of reading that into it. But again, yeah, that it's been transformed into something for drinking, is what that's about.
Do they know it's wine yet?
That's a great question. I think they probably do because it's changed color, right? I feel like that's that something's happened. I think they know. The servants know, but we'll talk about what the servants know and what the master knows and what the bridegroom knows. But the implication here is pretty far-reaching. As we talked about a second ago, the true purification is no longer a reference to external things, hands and pots, but is entirely internal, right? And more importantly, the source of purification is not a pot with water in it. What's the new source of purification? The person who can turn water into wine, right? The person who's starting the celebration. The person who everywhere he goes is the walking, living, breathing new creation, right? That is if you want to go back to the ceremonial pots of water, I guess you could, but it's madness in the age of Christ. Right.
Well, if you go to a town or something like that, 5,000 people follow them out there, a mountain or something like that, so you can listen to it.
Oh yeah.
It had to be more than just, he was a good speaker and all that.
Yeah, and what's fascinating too is how often Jesus insults the people who are following him, right? And they still follow him.
Yeah.
Now don't get me wrong; they often leave too. Like my favorite term for John 6 is the great church shrinkage plan, because he goes from having tons of people following him at the beginning to this long chapter to the end, where there's just the 12, and they're like, "What just happened?"
Yeah.
And even he looks at them and goes, "You guys are going to leave?" They're like, "No, we can't." Peter says, "We can't go. But it kind of goes from this massive following all the way again. But yeah, and we're about and that's the thing. The Christian life, according to John, again and again, he's going to tell us, particularly in John 6, the Christian life is eating and drinking what Jesus provides. Even when he says scary stuff like, "You got to eat my flesh and drink my blood," in chapter 6, right? That you don't get to go, "I don't know, Jesus, I'm out," right? You don't get, that's not an option since the celebration began. Those terrifying parables where, people don't go to the wedding that's happening, right? And we just because someone's got to I got to take care of my donkey, or, I just got married, or all these reasons why people, I got all these things I got to do, Jesus, or, Jesus, of course, is the character of the parable, but it's all these people who neglect to go to the wedding feast, and miss out on the celebration. And if you're not in the celebration, what are you in?
Left behind.
At least, right? It's not good. I mean, when and then even if you're at the wedding and you're not in the right garment, what happens?
Ruining the undergarments.
There's weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? Weddings are all over the Gospels, right? And so we have to, whenever we think of this wedding feast at Cana, the thing that should be popping into our minds is, how is this related to the wedding feast at the end of time? That has to be constantly in our minds when we're thinking about this parable. Please.
That never made sense to me. He invited the street people into the wedding party, and then some guy shows up without the right dress, and he say kick him out. I don't understand.
That by our standards, that sounds pretty harsh, maybe perhaps. There are a couple theories. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say theories. There are a couple different ways we could look at that. It's been noticed that in this period that oftentimes people who came to these weddings were given wedding garments at it, particularly depending on their status. So you have a case where someone said, "No, I won't wear that." That's possible. The possible take there, Matthew is making the point, and Jesus is making the point in this parable, and Matthew is providing this to us. That whole "many are called, few are chosen" has teeth. That to presume you have the right garment is bad. Is not right way to go to the wedding. I think that's really more likely the interpretation there. I like the idea that everyone gets a garment and the guy says no. That's neat in my head and that kind of sounds, but I don't think, that's kind of I think that's a way to try to get around the fact that this parable, like most of Jesus' parables, does have real teeth. And it's a sense in which the presumption that you belong at that feast is the best way to not belong at that feast. Right? Even this evening, when we read that gospel story about going to the wedding and where you sit at the wedding, that idea of a base, like the person who's humble in that case situation is the one who will be exalted. All of it is the thrust of it is the attitude of the human being going into that situation is enormously important. I mean, are we clothed in the righteousness of Christ or are we not? Right? And to God, that's obvious. I mean, if we show up at the judgment in our own works or with the ceremonial washing, who cares? It's if we show up at the judgment wearing the robe of Christ's righteousness, where God looks at us and all he sees is the imputed righteousness of Christ, rather than our own sinfulness, or, frankly, our good works. That's what he sees as Christ, then we are his sons and daughters. Right? That's the thing that's necessary there. So you can absolutely see where a person's like, and again, I think this works well with the idea of the wheat and the tares, the sheep and the goats, people who are there and think they belong there and don't. St. Augustine, the City of God, has a really great passage on this. As a matter of fact, Laura and I were talking about this the other day, has a great passage on this where he says, this is when after the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, he said there are lots of people in our churches who will not be in heaven, and there are lots of people in the street who will. Right? We have to deal with that and work with that. And also, that should embolden our evangelism, right? That God will use us as the instrument to bring those people outside in, right? And not to just be sufficient with the people we see sitting around us. Right? And that's a great thing. I mean, people oftentimes knock Augustine for being, a predestinarian or not believing in kind of the proto-Calvin, those kinds of things, right? But for Augustine, that never cuts off the need for evangelism and the need to go out. Just because God's grace is sovereign doesn't mean that our work as instruments of that grace stops. How could it?
With the
Those are the clown. No, I'm just kidding. What is that?
The way you can tell if people were elected, people who were, I can't tell, he says, I can't see who's elected, who's not elected, but anybody that runs around saying, I'm elected, probably is. I mean,
could be Calvin.
I think
It sounds more like
probably Calvinist.
maybe top maybe. Sounds like top maybe. Rocket ages. Very. But yeah, I mean yes. No, I think that's a really key. Yeah. Again, that this. Well, yeah, it is that is the most important attitude of reverence for Jesus is humility, right? Okay.
Humility about ourselves.
Oh, of course. Yeah, we can't really. I mean, yeah, you can't really be humble about God. Like, I'm really humble about my brother's ability to do something. It's not being humble; it's being a jerk, right? Right? That's not humility. And a way of elevating ourselves. No, you can only be humble about oneself. Make it matter.
I like it as somebody who wants to pray for somebody else's spiritual healing.
Yeah.
And doesn't say anything on their spiritual healing. But then you're like, what?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I understand that. All right. So the master of the feast has sent the wine as he provides all the celebration, and so now there's sort of a sense in which he tests it. Right? He tests the wine. Verse 9. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, thanks John, and did not know where it came from. Remember, that's the first time you get the idea that this water turned into wine. And he did not know where it came from. Though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. So, the master of the feast is clueless. The servants know. It's the servants who know, not the master of the feast, not the one who should. And so who does he go to talk to? He goes to talk to the bridegroom. So these are the most important people at the feast. The bridegroom and the master of the feast, right? The most important. So then he goes to talk to the bridegroom. Of course, this is John loves irony. It's one of the best traits of his gospel is how much he loves irony and how he uses irony to show us things, right? And it's ironic. The master of the banquet, the person who should have the most knowledge and authority over this, doesn't know what's going on. Is clueless, and he knows less than the servants. That's a great John irony. That should hit us, right? And this forced him to call the bridegroom. And so the story, interesting, has reversed the importance of people in the wedding. Right? The servants are now more important. What is unknown to even the characters themselves is that this is the fulfilling of the real. It forces us to ask the question: well, who is the real bridegroom and master of this wedding? Right? If these two guys are incompetent, don't know what's going on, who is the real bridegroom and master of the wedding? And it's supposed to force us into saying, oh man, it's actually Jesus. Jesus is the bridegroom and master of this wedding. Right? And it should point us to also, like for instance, that fact that something like Isaiah 25 is coming true. So I'll read that quickly. Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the scandal of this whole thing, right? Is that the bridegroom has failed in his job, right, to make the celebration happen. Indeed. Oh, yeah, I know. So in Isaiah 25:6, we have this revelation of what the Lord of hosts will do, right? He says, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine. Of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord hath spoken, it will be said on that day, behold, this is our God, we have waited for him, that he might save us. This is the Lord, we have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. So there's this sense here in this that Jesus has found a way to turn this wedding emergency into a heralding of the Isaiah prophecy coming true. What else does that sound like? What is that Isaiah prophecy to ring in our ears and make us think of another book of the Bible, this time in the New Testament? That idea of tears being wiped away. Tickle fingers?
Yeah, the mud,
No, not that. Not even that. I mean, the mud is the sign of the new creation. Where do we have in the Bible, in the New Testament, where it talks about the idea of all tears being wiped away, the new creation, consummated revelation, right?
Oh, yeah.
Literally uses the same language. But this time, it's not talking about a prophecy that's far off. It's talking about this thing that's already happened. And when it talks about what? The wedding feast of the Lamb. Revelation 19 talks about the wedding feast of the Lamb. And it talks about all this happening. And so what we're getting, this little fascinating taste, so to speak, right here, is this taste, this beginning of the wedding feast of the Lamb. Prophesied by Isaiah, made real and alive in Jesus, and fully consummated at the wedding feast of the Lamb in the new heaven and earth. We're getting this tiny little taste of it right now. And Jesus manages to move all this to make that proclamation of himself. But for who is a great question. Who is this about? Who is this for? Right? Because again, he's not telling the whole crowd. Let's see. Let's keep going. All right. Verse 10. 2 more verses. We're done. And said to him, this is the master talking to the bridegroom. Everyone serves the good wine first. And when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. I love Bible translations. Drunk freely. This word you have here, methustosin, right? It means pretty much get drunk, right? Right is the idea. Now remember, this is not a prescriptive of the Bible. The Bible's not saying, oh man, get drunk whenever you want. Because of course, Ephesians 5:18 says don't get drunk, right? Because it leads you to sin. This is a description of what often happens at weddings, right? Which again is one of those hilarious things about when you read silly, goofy interpretations of this, where Jesus makes like the best non-alcoholic wine they've ever had. That's preposterous, given what is the conversation that's actually happening right here. It doesn't make any sense if they're talking about drinking doers, right? That's not what's happening. This is wine as anyone would understand it. They're perfectly good words for grape juice or non-alcoholic wine. None of them are chosen in any of these passages. Either Isaiah, like we just saw, like what is well-aged wine? Like I don't know. Let me think for a second. Probably wine. Or here, where they're talking about wine that gets you inebriated, right? Now he's saying though that usually though the practice, which makes sense, is you get to bring out the good stuff first, and then when everyone's had a little bit to drink, you bring the bad stuff, right? And he says to him, no, that's not what's happened here. You have kept the good wine until now. What I love is the bridegroom doesn't say, what wine? He's just like, yeah, that sounds great. And he doesn't contradict him. Like, yep, I sure did. I'm the hero. Classic human, right? That's exactly what people do. Like, this should remind you of people who like brag about how they saved themselves, how great they are. This is pretty much the same thing, where Jesus literally, bends creation to make wine into water, and then someone's like, man, I threw a great wedding. Yes, that's humans all over, right? That's just us, down to it.
For people that have found Jesus.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I mean, so my image of this, of course, is something. I love it. People talk about, I gave myself to Jesus. Okay, but sort of if you're drowning in the ocean, and the Coast Guard comes up and throws you a life preserver, and you go and throw your hand on it, and then they drag you in and put you in the boat, and you go, man, I sure did grab that life preserver well, didn't I? Yep. Yeah, that's a preposterous thing to say, right? Now you participated, I suppose, but you're not the hero of the story by any stretch of the imagination. So the master gives the bridegroom credit for what Jesus has done, and the irony again demands that Jesus be seen as fulfilling the role of the bridegroom. Who is the real bridegroom at this wedding? It's Jesus. As John will make clear, in case you don't get this, 2 chapters later, John says Jesus is the true bridegroom, right? In case you missed it here, I wonder what's going on. John 3:29, Jesus is bridegroom. So, I mean, that's a theme in this whole idea. Spoiler alert. I mean, that's the thing that's coming. But you should get that here already, because the irony should drive us there. And then verse 11. This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So who is this about? Who is this about? This miracle is about the disciples, right? Because he doesn't do it publicly for everyone to say how great he is. He just lets that lie. But the disciples know, and the servants know, right? So the beginning here. You have a question, please?
No, I was thinking, this is going to
No, that's right.
but God, well, isn't it kind of, he has all sorts of, there's God made Jesus, well, not Jesus, but God made Noah, make sure there was, somebody forgot the wine.
Oh, so sure. So
he
how?
knew,
Yeah.
So he knew it was coming. I mean,
Yeah, so like how far back is God making all this happen? It's sort of like one of those classic sort of hypothetical questions. Did God make there not be wine with this thing so that he could do this? Or was this a screw up by human beings? It's a classic first cause, second cause argument, right? Like God is the author of creation. So you could say, oh yeah, God caused this to happen, right?
well,
But no, it's a good thing to bring up because people are so confused about first cause, second cause, right? You're absolutely right. God, as the author of all creation, yeah, you could blame him for there not being wine in this thing. But no, it's perfectly fine. The real cause of it, right, is the bridegroom being a cheapskate or something like that. Right?
He knew his creation was the previous law.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Run out of wine.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And again, I mean, God doesn't create sin, but He can use sin for His purposes. And here, you have another great example. So much of that. I mean, our entire religion is focused on the time when God used the evil of man to save the world, the cross, right? So it is not. So can God use somebody being a cheapskate at their own wedding for His glory? You bet. Which is good news because that means He can use His pieces of garbage like us for His glory, right? That is good news. That's excellent news. But what comes next? So again, this is the first time John uses this term "signs." It's his preferred term for miracle, right? Signs of things to come. This is the beginning of the signs, right? John again loves that beginning word too. Another way of saying this, you can kind of turn it around a little bit to kind of make it look clearer what the meaning is. What he's trying to say to his audience, what you just saw, that was the glory of God, and His name is Jesus. Right? Remember, this is John narrating his own gospel, right? So he's letting us know that what you just saw was the glory of God. Remember in the prologue when he talks about he beheld His glory. You're starting to get it. You're starting to behold His glory, right? And not just it's not just a magic trick, right? That's not the glory being described here, right? The glory is that the bridegroom has come, right? Who is the groom's bride? The church. The church is the bride of Christ, right? And so the bridegroom has come. The marriage is happening, and the earth is going to be saved. Right? This story is about saving the earth. It's not just about Jesus being like David Copperfield or something at a wedding, right? Which is how it can sometimes be described. I hear all sorts of crazy like that's not what it's about. Or Jesus comes in the clutch. Jesus comes to save the world and reveal His glory, right? The party is not. Yeah, it is an analogy. It is a stand-in for saving the world. Right, which is what's happening. The church, the bride of Christ, has joined herself to the true bridegroom and awaits the real celebration to come. Every day we're awaiting that celebration. Right? I mean, it's the reason that a feast is the center of our religious life. Right? The Eucharist is the center of our religious life because that's our connection both to the sacrifice of Christ, but also the connection forward to the feast. The wedding feast of the Lamb. We're connected to that. Why do you think we eat our main service? Of all the things we could do, right? Like we could, burn something or blow something up or dance around, or you could do all sorts of things. The main focus of our religion is the wedding feast. Is why, right? It's the symbol of the new heaven and new earth, the abundance of the new heaven and new earth. So, you also have this fascinating aspect in which John wants us to see that the church has seen the glory of God and has to show that glory of God to the rest of the guests of the wedding. And the rest of the wedding is the world. The church, whether they're the disciples or the servants of this wedding, have to show that glory is definitely an aspect of this too. Thus, at one and the same time, the church is blessed with the promise of glory and committed to participation in the mission of the Son from his Father. Jesus is on a mission to save the world, a mission he volunteered for, to lovingly follow the will of his Father, to obediently die on the cross. That this is a sign of that. So there's a lot going on at the wedding feast of Cana. And it's really worth thinking about it and wrapping our heads around just what Jesus is doing here. All right, any questions on that? Questions, thoughts? Yes?
Back to Jesus' answer to his father. Do you suppose that when he hesitated, seemed hesitated about providing the wine, did he have to think it over, determine the will of God before he would act? Is that what was happening there?
I think and we have to be sort of careful when we examine Jesus' motives for the things he says. I mean, it's always tough. We're always speculating a bit, right? I think we can know from that conversation that Jesus is slightly distancing himself from his mother's authority, right? He's on his mission now, right? His unshakable mission to the cross, right? That he can't be distracted from love. So there's that aspect of what he's doing, but it's not an unloving response to her. There's a sense in which this is only a possible thing to do if it's part of that mission, right? And so, is he thinking it over? Did he know going to that wedding that that this was a thing he was going to do? It's always, the exact point at which human nature and divine nature come together is always a tricky space for us to speculate on. And John doesn't really give us that here. John will tell us in other places that Jesus knew what people were thinking. He knew what was coming. He knows the cross. He knows everything that's coming in there. So there's a sense in which, is he doing these things for his disciples? Is he responding to Mary for Mary's sake? It's a fascinating thing to consider. Is he talked to her that way for her, even though he knows he's going to make the wine? That's entirely possible within the narrative. So again, it's really tough for us to know that exact answer, but John is at pains here to show us that Jesus is not surprised by stuff. Right? He's not sort of a hapless victim of the plan of salvation. He starts at the beginning. At the beginning, right? The beginning was what it says. From before everything was Jesus, and he's God. So, from before everything, did he know he was going to make wine at this wedding? It's difficult for us to imagine omniscience without that. Right? So I guess I think our answer would have to be, yeah, he does know. And then sort of that opens up the possibilities of that. But again, that's speculation. It doesn't change anything really, but it is fascinating to consider that. But I would err on the side of, yeah, he knows what's happening here. Other thoughts, questions?
On here, on the last verse,
Yes.
the disciples leave with his mother and his brothers. His mother and brothers and the disciples.
Talking about John 12?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we'll talk about that next week.
Oh, that next week, okay.
Yeah. Did you have a question about that that we can...
No, I just thought it was this idea that you had no brothers and sisters.
Well, I mean, the issue... This is a longer talk, and we can talk about this one last week. There's a whole bag of bricks that throwing each other. I'll just say that there are two perfectly legitimate ways to take that. Whether we're talking about brothers from a previous marriage, or whether those are Mary's children, it's difficult from the text to make that perfect call either way. Again, John's not that super concerned. We're much more. No. Joseph's previous.
Oh, Joseph's previous.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah. So it's talking again. We're much more concerned about this than John is, frankly. We'll talk about it a little bit, but again, either way does not blow up the earth or anything. I mean, it does. I mean, it has implications in terms of how kind of medieval thought on Mary. Kind of big thoughts on her in general. There are a lot of stuff going on there, but it doesn't blow up the gospel if we walk down one of those roads and insist on it. I think we need to have a little bit of charity there and a little bit of understanding of people's positions in that realm. And as long as we are faithful to the text in front of us, as best we can be, we'll be all right. But yeah, we'll talk about that more later. I've already talked about it probably more than I probably should right now. Other thoughts? Yes?
Do you think this could be part of the diaconal passage?
It's possible. I mean, we mentioned last week.
One time this word is used.
Yeah, that's right. The servant idea. I mean, I think.
And in fact, they're bringing this word there for their water out of the jars. They're coming from a living well, a living water idea. So they're bringing the gospel literally to the feast, to the church.
Here's what I'll say on this. Were there deacons when John wrote this in the late first century? Yes, there were. So John would have known when he used that word that would have brought that up in people's minds, right? So it's possible. Now it can just mean servant. Like within its grammatical possibilities, it can just mean servant, right? But I think you're right, at least to have sort of your church history antenna come up that John uses this word to describe a servant of the Lord, which is functionally what a deacon is. So yeah, I would love to ask John and say, John, did you mean that there? I can't, but I want it. I'd like it to because I think it's pretty cool. I think it'd be a neat thing if that's what John is tipping his hat to. The diaconate. That's a really cool thing, particularly since the diaconate doesn't get a lot of love these days, or as much as they should. It's a very important thing, and every priest is always still the deacon. Every bishop is already still a deacon. You never stop being a deacon. It's kind of a cool thing. Anyway, all right. Other thoughts, concerns, fears, questions? Sarge, I'm scared. We gotta go over the hill tomorrow.
Why do you take the deacons with them?
Well, no. They were not saying that they are the established deacon or order.
Oh, it's just
the idea here is that when John writes this, right? Exactly. It's sort of a callback, kind of a way. That's possible. It really is. Because remember, this gospel is written late first century. You've already got an established. I mean, Paul's writing about deacons in the 50s.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, Acts tells us deacons were the first thing set up order. So that a lot of time where that's a live term in the church. I think it's entirely possible John's using it as a call out for that to talk about servants. But he could just be talking about servants. Also possible. We'll ask him when we get to heaven. Yes.
I think also changing the water proves he changed the water, and who else but the Creator could change the water? I mean, we can. I mean, technically, you can sort of change matter today. That's 2,000 years and about $100,000 of ground that you can change. He changed 120 gallons into
doesn't even say move, right? He's told to do it, right?
Yeah.
So at his command. I mean, what does that remind us of? The creation, right? I mean, you say something and it happens, right? I definitely think you're right to see John that he's showing himself. And the miracles are meant to show his glory, show who he is. The mission of Jesus is divine revelation, right? That's what John tells us, right? So that we, as human beings, once again interact with the living God, right? And so one way of knowing this is God is he turns water into wine. Right? Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think
It
that's.
doesn't start a business going from wedding to wedding, start changing.
That'd be a great business because that's not what it's about. Just like he doesn't set up a health clinic either,
Yeah.
right? He does. I mean, God can heal people by touching them, or they touch the hem of his garment. He doesn't set up a health clinic.
Doesn't
Because that's-
need to touch me. He did.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he says, "Go on home. They're healed," right? But because the healing, the temporary healing of people, is not the most important thing in the world, right? The wedding feast is the most important thing. The new heaven and new earth, where there's no more tears, there's no more pain. That is the most important thing in the world, and that takes a cross. That's why the hour the hour is the most important thing, right? Big deal, big key there. That's also true for the church as well. The most important thing the church does is not fund hospitals, right? That's an incredibly important witness to the world that we're willing to give of our things to help others. That shows that we believe that this is coming, right? But the most important thing the church does is worship our King. We can't ever lose sight of that. If we become a social organization, then we betrayed our trust that this celebration is the most important thing that's coming. And that, in fact, has already been inaugurated by Christ. It's a big idea that we can't lose sight of. Other questions, thoughts, fears, hopes? All right, everyone, very good. We just went a little bit over, but